Okay, good morning, particularly those of you in Thailand where it's 6 a.m. or Hong Kong and Singapore where it's 7 a.m., although I suspect most of you are listening to this recording from this part of Asia. We talked to you about 52 things we wish someone had told us about customer analytics. The we is my son, Alex, who is at Deloitte and does customer analytics there. So the start of this book is because if we look at the cartoon on the left, in the 1990s, the web was anonymous. No one knew you were a dog, if you remember back that far. And now we know that there's a lot more data about us available. And we see on the right that the CIA knows all, or at least pretends to know all. So there's a lot more data out there. But despite that, if we look at the next page, and this is from a Vision Critical webinar, and they worked with Forrester and did a survey and found that the use of analytics to drive decision wasn't good. It was less than 50% of decisions were driven by analytics. And in fact, the trend was in the wrong direction, which is it was getting worse. So there are many reasons for that, and I don't pretend to know them all. But one that my son and I believe is that there's a disconnect between the people who create analytics, and by analytics we mean market research or big data and all the different combinations thereof, and the people who use them. And so what we've pulled together is 52 examples where we think it can help people who create the analytics do a better job of communicating with the people who use them and vice versa. So I'm going to use 8 of them today, and I'll go through them one by one and then come back to this as a summary. So the first one is being taught to us by Ted Levitt. And he reminds us we need to focus on output, not tools. That people don't want to buy a quarter-inch drill, they're buying a quarter-inch hole. And this is something that people in market research are often very guilty of, because we love talking about our drills, how fast they are, how wonderful they are, how modern they are, how they're wireless or whatever. When the client is saying, I have a problem, can you help me solve my problem? Sometimes the tool is necessary, and sometimes there are simpler ways if you don't focus on the tool. So Ted Levitt says focus on outputs and not tools. Second point I wanted to make is my saint of market research. Now, most people don't think of Tom Cruise as a saint, but if you've seen the movie Jerry Maguire, and if you haven't, I recommend it, the seminal line, or one of the seminal lines, is show me the money. And what Tom is taught by his clients is it's all about how much money I make. And if you want to make sure you engage a CEO or CMO or division manager, you need to link what you're doing to how they make money. Now, sometimes we're working for government or not-for-profits is a different metric, but in most cases, it's linking what you're doing. And if you can't make the link, then they're not that interested. And if we had more time, we'd talk about how you connect that. But the second point is, link what you're doing to profitability or revenue, and ideally both. Third is to make sure that you are helping solve a real problem. So BS in this case is not what you think it is. BS is business significance, which is, are you influencing or changing a decision? So I use this matrix you see here. Vertical is uncertainty. I'm not sure what to do to I'm sure what to do on the bottom. And value at risk, either I'll make or lose a lot of money, low to high. And what we want to be doing is operating in the top right-hand corner. That's where we want to be using analysis. Yet all too often we're in the bottom left corner where, frankly, you should tell the client to use their judgment. Because if there's low uncertainty, they've already decided what they're going to do. Whether or not they're right or not is irrelevant. They have high confidence at what they're going to do, and they don't think it matters. So what we want to be doing is spending our time in that top right-hand corner and doing more analysis there and less in the bottom corner where we're often doing too much work. If we had more time, I'd give you examples where really focusing there was valued by the client. By the way, even if you're not giving them certainty in an answer, but you're simply reducing the uncertainty. So we want to, focus on output, show the money, and focus where it matters. Those are sort of the business imperatives, if you will. Fourth, if we then start to talk about how do we use analysis correctly, is to beware of meaningless numbers. So a client of mine a few years ago said, on average, I'm an absolutely wonderful golfer. I hit the ball straight down the fairway onto the green. No, on average, I'm a great golfer. The reality is I'm a lousy golfer because half my shots go right and half my shots go left. So on average, I'm great, but the reality is I'm awful. Now, this is a funny example, but we all too often fall into this trap in the real world. So if we look at the next chart, you see this is a table from a pharmaceutical study looking at brand strength. It was asked of different kinds of doctors in different kinds of settings. This is the kind of table we'd normally see coming out of DP, and we sort of look at the numbers, then we try and figure out what they mean. And we look at the 33 and the 35 that are highlighted there under General Hospital or Area 2. And what do they mean? They actually mean nothing. Why do I have the areas in red? Well, particularly in this study, but again, I'm generalizing to the misuse of averages, is a cardiologist, when they're evaluating a drug company, is hopefully thinking about cardiology drugs, and a psychiatrist is hopefully thinking about different drugs. So when you average them as being the General Hospital, or you average them in an area, what you get is a meaningless number. It's akin to being an expert golfer. So we have to be aware of those meaningless calculations. In addition, we have to be aware of misusing analysis. So if you took Stats 101, you learned in the first week that correlation is not causality. Dilbert teaches us that here, or Scott Adams teaches here. And the pointy-haired boss keeps wondering why he gets that particular email every time he leaves Dilbert's cubicle. Dilbert is clueless because Wally reminds us that correlation isn't causality. Now, again, like many of the examples I'm going to share, we know this. And you may be sitting there saying, isn't that basic? But we often forget this in the real world. And this is why there's a disconnect between end users and providers sometimes. So this is an example of a team. This team was in Korea, and they were studying how to improve sales for an FMCG client. And they said, we have figured out what to do. There is a correlation between shelf space and sales. So we are recommending to the client that they rent more shelf space because that will drive sales. And I agreed there was a correlation, but I said, what if it goes the other way? My experience taught me otherwise, which is when you sell more, they give you more shelf space because the retailer doesn't want to run out of stock. They don't want to lose sales. So you've got a correlation, but you probably don't have causality there. Without going into the details, there's two other examples I've included, and these are from a webinar that Ray did earlier this year. And in one case, missing the real driver, which for ice cream sales is the season of the year. And an even more concerning one, which was hormone replacement therapy, which not only was the conclusion incorrect, it was actually reversed. So something they thought was improving women's health actually was making them sicker. And it was only by digging through and using the gold standard that they were able to get to the right answer. So what is the gold standard? The gold standard is testing. A/B testing, different forms of testing, but usually A/B and test and control. So what you're looking at here is a statement of mine from Capital One. They are an excellent believer in testing. They test an incredible number of things. And this is one statement. And what I want you to look at on the next few pages is the highlighting, because it shows how many tests they do just in one statement to one person. So they test, and 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 they test. So all that was from one statement. Now, it's not just testing, it's learning from it. So this is not from Capital One. This is from work done at McKinsey when I was there. And it shows the improvement you can make by rigorous testing and learning. And you can see this was call center and testing different scripts. And you can see over the course of 8 weeks, by testing, changing what your champion was, continuing to improve it with more tests and being rigorous about that, a substantial improvement in results. So test and learn, and that's how you avoid the trap of correlation and causality, but also how you improve your own performance. 6, challenge your metrics. So we're all familiar with mean square error, R-squared, typical metrics, and statisticians have many they can use. As we're taught early on by a Harvard professor, right, we have to think about the output. And the same thing when you're thinking about your metrics, which is don't necessarily accept metrics, but think about, does the metric support the business objective that you're after? So this is from actually my second son as an example, and he's an aerospace engineer. He talked about landing a rocket on a landing pad. One could be in the water on the left, and one could be on the land on the right. Now, if you think about how precise you need to be, the vertical is the same for both of them. You need to land at the right velocity so you're not going too fast and you don't crash and you don't out of fuel and crash for different reasons. So vertically, you could use the same metric, but when you think about latitude and longitude, you would do differently. Why? Well, if you're landing on land, those tend to be immovable platforms in some pretty forbidding locations because you don't put them in urban locations. Versus when you're landing on water, you can actually move the platform. So you have a lot more leeway to adjust for error if you're over water than land, and therefore you would use a different metric. And what you want to have a conversation with your statistician saying, what are you penalizing or what are you rewarding in your metrics? And does that link with your business objective? And in the example here, you want to reward precision when you're landing on land. You can be more flexible when you're landing on water. 7, seeing but not understanding. And this perhaps is one of the best arguments for why big data won't totally take over the world, as some predict. Because sometimes the data, you need to go beneath it. So the woman on the left who's wearing a mask, if I ask you why she's wearing a mask, that's a trick question. You can see it, but you don't understand until you have the context. Because if she's in New York, she might be protecting herself from air pollution. If she is in Tokyo, she is protecting others because she has a cold. So exactly the opposite purpose. On the right, we see a bottle of Coca-Cola, and the question is, what category are you seeing? And a mistake that I believe was made in China many years ago by a Morgan Stanley analyst is he was trying to explain per capita consumption of Coke and differences between China and elsewhere. And he ascribed it to pricing in China. And I think he was avoiding, because he was looking at the bottle and saying he is seeing a bottle of carbonated soft drink or sparkling beverage or whatever you want to call it. And even thinking about it as a category as a beverage, where in China, in fact, most of your liquid consumption in many settings is via soup. And so your competitor isn't necessarily Pepsi, but actually a bowl of soup. So you need to understand the context to understand it. And the middle one, we've all played pool at some point. We've all seen the colored balls go into the pocket and not come back. And we've seen the white ball go into the pocket and come back. And why is that? Can you tell that by just looking at it? Well, I will tell you that the balls are all the same size. They're all the same shape. They're all the same weight. There's no difference. And if you go underneath the table, you will not find some fancy electromechanical or computer device controlling it. What you will find when you get beneath the surface is that there's a metal core in the white ball and there's a magnet underneath the table, and that's how it ends up in the right place. So sometimes you see, but you don't understand what you're seeing without digging deeper. And last point is asking questions. And this comes back to the first point about understanding your output, linking it to showing the money, looking for uncertainty that matters. So you need to ask questions to make sure you're answering the right problem. So years ago, I joined a telecom company and they said, can you help us with our churn model? Churn is what happens at contract renewal. Do people stay or do they go to the competition? And I said, sure, done a lot of that. Do you want to predict who will churn? Or do you want to predict what competitor they'll churn to, because you might have a different offer for people who are going to different competitors? Or maybe what you want to do is predict who will respond to a specific churn offer. You're not interested in what carrier, but just you have 5 or 10 offers and you want to know which one to send them. Or maybe you shouldn't do anything, which was actually the answer here. Why is that? Because when I asked them, how do you use the churn model? They said, well, we call everybody who's up for contract renewal and we offer them a standard offer. There's different price levels, but everybody gets the same offer. And if they don't recontract on that first call, we make a second call. And the second call is exactly the same offer. And if they don't recontract on the second call, we call them a third time. So why do you need a churn model? You're not predicting, you're not using anything that would require that. Well, sometimes when we get to the third call, we run out of calling capacity and we need to figure out who to make the third call to. Well, at that point, it's a waste of time because you're actually not going to much impact churn. And the real question was to go back and re-engineer the process. So by asking questions, you go from, we know specifically tech, tool, and technique, and we don't fall into the trap, and we think about what the output is that matters. So this is just a sample of the things my son and I have collected from our various work. Think about the whole, the output, and not the drill. Think about showing the money. BS matters, business significance that is. Be aware of meaningless numbers and calculations, and remember that correlation is not causality. Challenge your metrics, see and understand, and ask a lot of questions. If you want more, there's 52 things available on Amazon. And with that, Sue, I think we can move to questions.
Thank you very much, Mike. So, Mike, sounds like you've got some more tips that time prevented you from sharing with us today. If you could have had a 9th and a 10th in that list, what would they have been?
Oh, there are so many. I'm not sure which one I would pick. There are a bunch of other techniques that get used or misused. So there's a few chapters on, for example, using conjoint and understanding what drives choice by asking people to make trade-offs and why that's important versus asking direct questions, because that's a mistake that people often make. And end users don't understand that, so you have to explain it to them. It seems a bit more opaque. So it's that. And I end the book with one of the challenges I found in market research, which is not sometimes the quality of the conclusions, but the poor communication of those conclusions. And so actually at the end of the book, I share tips for how to write a short, concise report so that when you have the right conclusions, you can make sure your audience understands them.
Okay. Here's a question about Net Promoter Score. What's your view on Net Promoter Score and its use by organizations? Are there any alternative metrics you would recommend?
I think we'd need another webinar for that subject alone. I will tell you that I understand why Net Promoter Score is very popular, because if you go back to output, it's a concise number that senior management can put their hands around and understand. The challenge I have with Net Promoter Score is when someone says, great, I know my score, how do I improve my score? There's a weak link between Net Promoter Score and the diagnostics that are connected to it. So my preference is usually for something where I can not only tell you how you're scoring, but when someone says how I improve it, I can answer that. And that's one of the weaknesses of Net Promoter Score. But I recognize the strength, which is it's simple to understand and therefore easy to get management attention. So it's got strengths and weaknesses which can be addressed by appropriately discussing it with your audience.
Thanks. Mike, you talked early in your presentation about a potential disconnect between the people doing the analytics and the people using the analytics. And you've obviously got some good rules of thumb and guidance in your book. Is there anything else you'd make recommendations around, say, good ways for data users and analysts to work together? Any tips for working on those relationships?
Well, there's sort of two levels to that. One is working with the client and who often is the insights manager. And sometimes they have good answers to the questions, particularly the show me the money, where you say, how am I going to use this piece of research to drive sales or share or pricing or drive the market demand? But sometimes they don't. And so what you often have to do is encourage them to go with you to the end user, or encourage them to have the conversation with the end user so that you have a better example. And often people are nervous about that because they're coming from the research community rather than from the business community. And they often don't understand the fundamentals of the business they're in as well as they could. And they're a bit nervous about those conversations. So often it's helping them either have the conversation or going along with them so they become more comfortable. Same thing for short, concise reports. Often people, it's a defensive or insurance mechanism. They want to have 200-page reports because all the data is in there. If anybody asks a question, it'll be sure to be answered somewhere in the 200 or the 300 or 800 pages. And so often it is going with them and showing them how a shorter report will actually make management happier, contrary to their expectation. And I've got a couple of anecdotes in the book where that happened and people were pleasantly surprised to learn that they could not only get away with a shorter report, but that actually the client liked it better.
Okay, what's your view about data analytics and data scientists becoming more popular amongst client organizations versus market researchers?
So data scientist, a true data scientist, understands the tools and techniques, the software and the hardware, how to manipulate the data, but they often are not clued into that end user output, and that's not their expertise. So with them, it's the same issue that prior question on how you go with an insights manager. It's how do you connect them so that you understand, that they understand the output that will be useful to the end users. I'm a belief that that's not necessarily going to be a data science role. That's asking too much of the people who are data scientists. And what you need is an intermediary who can translate the business question into analytic design and then retranslate the output into something a business user can use. And that rather than expecting that of data scientists, what you need is, some sort of integrator, and there's different titles for it in the organization, so that the data scientists can do what they do well, and the integrators can make sure that the output, what they do and the output is useful to end users.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you very much for sharing your insights on data analytics with us today.
Thank you very much.